Hello, we're starting a brand new series today, and we're going to be looking at David the King and the lessons that he learned, the life principles he had to live by. One of the first ones that he needed to know in his preparation to become king was that of forgiveness, how to live in forgiveness. At the end of 1 Samuel, David left King Saul coming up to fight the Philistines. He deserted the Philistines, went back to the town of Ziklag where he had left his family, his wives, all of his possessions. He gets there, the city is burned. And at that point, David realizes he has nowhere to turn. No help from his friends, no resources, no strength left within him. There's nowhere that he can turn to but God. This is a life-changing time for David as he renewed his commitment and his relationship with God and found the strength that he needed to lead those men into battle, to recapture his wives, and to come back to that city of Ziklag. After being there for 3 days, he has another life-changing event when a man arrives with a message. In 2 Samuel 2, verses 2 through 4, it says, "A man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell on the ground. And David said, 'Where have you come from?' And he said, 'I've escaped from the camp of Israel.' David said, 'How did the matter go? Please tell me.' He answered, 'The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen and dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead also.'" Think of the emotions that could have flooded David. He hears that his number one arch enemy, King Saul, is dead, and he could have remembered Saul, the one who tried to kill me, causing me to leave my palace and my calling. He's the reason that I'm now without a wife, without family, and without relatives, living in caves, going from place to place until I finally end up here in a foreign country. Saul, who killed 85 priests, all because they innocently gave me food and a Goliath sword, which I had already obtained. I've been a fugitive and on the run for years, living with the Philistines and doing things that I never thought I would do, all because of him. Reliving those emotions could have caused anger, hatred, or maybe even relief and pleasure, knowing that Saul was finally out of the way and he didn't have to do it, and he'd no longer have it on the conscience of him, David, having to kill the person. How about you? How would you respond, knowing that your greatest enemy, the one who had caused not just you, but all of your family, all of your friends, so much heartache and hurt, was finally out of the way? Would you feel the anger, the relief? It would take a certain person to respond in exactly the way David did. 2 Samuel 1:11 and 12 says, "David took hold of his own clothes, and he tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned, and they wept, and they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." Well, it's not too hard for us to understand the weeping, the fasting, the mourning for Jonathan, and for all the soldiers who had so valiantly given their lives, given everything they could. But that's not the normal response for the death of an enemy. David is starting to show what he's really made of here. And it was then at that point that David turned to the man and said, well, just how do you know? You came from his camp, but how do you know for sure that Saul died? And the man explained, oh, let me tell you, I helped him with a suicide. He claimed to have done that. And what did David do? Did he pat the man on the back and say, thank you so much for helping me out of this situation? You took care of a real problem. No. David, in turn, had this man killed. Why? Why would he do such a thing? Verse 16 of this chapter tells us, David said to him, your blood is on your own head, for with your own mouth you have testified against yourself, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. No matter what Saul did to David or to any of those around him, David always saw Saul as the anointed king and leader of Israel. He never lost perspective of that. And after getting justice for Saul as God's anointed king, how did David then respond? Well, verses 17 and 18 says that he went on and he lamented with a lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. When he lamented with a lamentation, it meant that he came up with a song. He wrote a song in their memory, not what we would expect. Oh, yeah, sure. Jonathan, his best friend, deserved a song, but not Saul, surely not after what he did. I mean, let's just chalk that up to emotions of the moment. But we have to really look carefully at what David said. He said, I want you to teach this to the children of Judah. He did not say teach it to Israel. He did not say teach it to the children of Benjamin. He said teach it to the children of Judah. And that's so important because Judah, this was the tribe that David came from. These were his relatives. And he said, when my relatives know about Saul and about my relationship, this is what I want them to know. He said, I want them to know the man that God called him to be. I want them to know who he was when I first met him. I want them not to see all of the anger, the jealousy, the cruelty, the lying. I want them to see the heart of the man that I first knew. He said, I want them to know that I have forgiven him. And what did that song have to say? Well, verses 19 through 24, it says, the beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Let not the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. O mountain of Gilboa, now that's where Saul died. Let there be no dew nor rain on you, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there. The shield of Saul, not anointed with oil, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxuries, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. David only sings of the strong and godly qualities of Saul. It's as though all those years of hurt, all those years of separation, all those years that he was running as a fugitive never existed. None of the hurt or heartache that Saul caused David, his family, or even the nation of Israel can be found in these lyrics. How could that happen? Well, it's possible because we know that David was a student of the Word. It was possible that perhaps he knew the life of Joseph. And he used Joseph as that example. And he found how to live in forgiveness as he followed the life of Joseph and remembered his journey to forgiveness. See, after Joseph's father died, his brothers thought Joseph would repay them for all the evil that they had done to him. How they had attempted, first of all, to kill him, but then decided to just sell him as a slave into Egypt. And like David, he was separated from his family for years. Well, Joseph brought the family back together. Everyone came, and he rescued them. And they were safe during the time of famine. Joseph was reunited with his dad, but after his dad died, the brothers got a little worried, thinking, oh my, what's going to happen to us now? Just suppose, Joseph decides to repay us for all the evil that we've done to him. And so they sent him a message. And the message says, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sins, for they did you evil. This is the first time in the Bible that the word forgive is used. And according to the law of first mention, what we do when we see a word that's used for the very first time in Scripture, an important word like the word forgive that lays down a principle, we look to the big meaning. And what they were saying to Joseph was, I ask that you'll forgive us. And in forgiving us, we want you to forget that we hurt you in the past and not hold us accountable in the future. What a great definition of forgiveness. Forget what we did to you in the past and not hold us accountable in the future. That's a really tough lesson for all of us. David had a real life application for this as he thought about what he was going to do. I think he followed Joseph's response. You see, Joseph immediately, when he heard this, he just broke down in tears, and that scared the brothers even more. So they all fell down and said, oh, Joseph, we're going to be your servants forever. Then Joseph expressed what the heart of true forgiveness is. And in Genesis 50, verses 19 through 21, Joseph said, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? For as for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about as it is this day, to save many people. Now, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph said, God is in control. You meant to hurt me. We're going to forget about that. And from this day on, I'm going to take care of you. Well, let's go back to David. And like Joseph, David forgave unconditionally. He knew that he had no authority to administer judgment. God reserved vengeance to himself. And so if he tried to administer justice or punishment, and if he did that and took revenge into his own hands, he would be assuming God's responsibility. And then the bottom line of that would be he would lose all respect for Saul, the one whom God had placed in authority over him at that time. We can see that David always remembered that Saul was God's chosen. He called him constantly, even when he was running from him, his king, his father. He knew that God had placed him there for that time and not David himself. And the moment that he did forget that God was in control and God was going to take care of him, what did he do? He got frustrated. He became fearful and took off running to the Philistines, where we find him in our first chapter. Forgiveness and vengeance do not mix. Vengeance divides. Forgiveness unites and brings together, as we can see in David's song when he says, "Let the people hear this song. I want it taught to everybody so they'll know what could happen." And how Saul at one time was a very good man. God's way of forgiveness brings peace to us and to all of our relationships. Forgiveness enabled God to deal with Saul in the way that he wanted to, in the time that he wanted to. David's forgiveness was not a feeling, but a decision. He could have thought, "Oh, I don't feel like forgiving him, so there's no need to do it." You see, it's easy to think that when we don't feel like forgiving and we go ahead and do it anyway, that we're being hypocritical, that's not what I feel. But you know what? God never commanded us to go by feeling. David did what he should do only because God said so. God talked about forgiveness. He knew in his heart that he should forgive, and he did it. Forgiveness, like all other forms of obedience, is nothing but an act of faith. It's not our feelings. Then David knew that his forgiveness had absolutely nothing to do with his forgetting. You see, once we forget something, it's not like someone comes and waves a magic wand over our mind and, oh, we've got a blank there. No, that's not happening like that. Forgiving Saul did not immediately erase the memory of hurt. Forgetting might come in time if David, or if we, refuse to dwell on the situation, or if we keep bringing it up to the one who's hurt us, or even to ourselves, or to others. We might for a while recall all the hurt. We might every once in a while, but we'll see as forgiveness goes on, remember all of that. But that does not mean that forgiveness took place. Forgiveness is an act. Forgetting is a process that takes time. And if in the process of forgetting the hurts do come to mind, we've still forgiven. That doesn't mean that it didn't take place, but we have to refuse to dwell on the memory. We have to become like David. David knew, I've got to speak good in the future. I've got to act good in the future. Joseph said, don't worry, I will take care of you and your little ones in the future. And then it says, and he spoke words of kindness and comfort to them. That's what David was doing in his songs. He was speaking words of kindness over Saul, even during that time that I know he had not yet forgotten all the hurts. Well, David's forgiveness meant that he was willing to suffer to bring about a healing. When David in the cave cut King Saul's robe, it said that his heart smote him. He immediately knew that he'd done wrong, but he was pressured by the men around him. Do something, take his life. And so he cut the robe. And the word says that when his heart smote him, that David went out and placed himself in a position before Saul and before all the armies of the mighty men that were following King Saul. He made himself vulnerable so that he could ask forgiveness. And it was because he asked forgiveness that God temporarily moved upon Saul's heart, that he softened his heart at that point, that he momentarily had a change. And when we forgive others, we allow God to move on their behalf. No, the past cannot be undone and we can't change it. But we do have the ability to make a change. We can change ourselves, and we can change how the future will be affected, both to ourselves and to others, by accepting it as from God's hand and not from the abuser's hands. Only then can hurt bring healing. David saw God in every offense from Saul. Nothing came his way unless God allowed it. He knew that he was the beloved of God, and he knew that God was using every circumstance in his life to bring him to the place that he needed him to be. Forgiveness indicates a trust in God to use the offense for our good and for God's glory. Because David learned to live in forgiveness when he received word from God, he was free. Oh, yes. He could move on with his life, knowing that God would be in control in every step he took. He was in control at that moment, and he would be in the future. And that's what happens with forgiveness. When you forgive someone, you can be free to go on with your life. There was no unforgiveness. There was no reason to blame self. And self-blame, living a life without self-blame, well, that's another important lesson that David needs to know before he does ascend the throne to become king. And that's where we're going to start next session.